So here we are then, just 1 week on after a great race in Brazil, and it's finally time for the F1 season finale, taking place over at Yas Marina for this year's Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. Normally I'd put in a joke here, but just saying Yas Marina circuit is a joke enough in itself. Coming into the weekend, the focus was on for the battle for second, as Sergio Perez and Charles Leclerc were equal on points. Now Checo would be ahead by a couple if he had anyone but Verstappen for a teammate, and by not letting Sergio back through in Brazil, it means that Max is probably doing more than Ferrari are to help Leclerc get that second place. Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the On Track channel and to round 22 in Abu Dhabi. Now before we get into it, as always, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoy it and hit subscribe for more of the F1 content. Also turn on notifications so you don't miss out on any videos. And as some of you will know, I'm getting a little puppy soon, and so if you want to see some of that content, then go get subscribed to or follow the channel, Instagram, TikTok most likely. I'll leave some links in the description. Now, with that out of the way, let's get into my honest review of Formula 1 and the 2022 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. So during the week there was a lot of bad chatter about Red Bull. Feel like I've been saying that a lot this year. But I of course do mean Verstappen deciding not to let Checo through for extra points in his and the team's quest to get P2 in the Drivers' Championship, with the most common theory being that Perez crashed on purpose in Monaco to deny Verstappen a chance to outqualify him. Even so, considering how Checo has obeyed team orders and helped him in France, Baku, Britain, Turkey and of course Abu Dhabi last year, not even to mention this year being told not to fight in Spain and Baku, plus taking points off Leclerc in Imola and Singapore. For Max to be unwilling to give up just 2 points for Sergio and the team, well, in the words of Checo,
yeah, it shows who he really is.
Elsewhere though, and the bigger news was over at Haas as they announced who'd partner Kevin Magnussen for 2023. Would it be Mick Schumacher given another chance, another season to live up to his F2 champion potential? Maybe Antonio Giovinazzi for his, well, whatever reason, maybe Gunter got drunk or something sending out the contracts. But as it turned out, it was neither of those two. Instead, oh yeah, Nico Hülkenberg is back, bringing F1 experience and consistency with him, along with zero chance of Haas ever stepping on the podium. It does also mean that from the off-season onwards, they'll no longer be known as Haas F1 team, but instead as Team Suck My Balls.
Once again, most unsportive driver of the grid.
Suck my balls, mate.
Yeah, you're really good, man.
Into FP1, and when I say nearly half the grid was young drivers, well, I'm not even lying. With a total of 7 F1 rookies in for an FP1 session as part of the mandatory 2 sessions that each team must fulfill, along with an 8 stand-in driver of Robert Kubica at Alfa Romeo, the team still not quite grasping the concept that F1 should really host the best drivers. However, one of the legit rookies was over at McLaren, and was one of their young IndyCar drivers, Pato O'Ward, who had the misfortune of just 2 minutes in having his car turn into the lesser spotted 4-wheeled Landsloth, trundling around the track in second gear and having to make it the entire lap before coming back into the pits. Over at Williams and in for Nicholas Latifi was Logan Sargent as he took the FW44 out on track, and as it turned out, off track, locking the rears and spinning off at turn 1 but just managing to come to a halt before planting the nose into the barriers. And finally, to round out the session was Felipe Drugovich getting a little bit in the way, going slowly into the final corner and causing just a little lock-up from the McLaren behind. Into FP2 then, and it was the Haas team having a field day getting in the way, with first up Kevin Magnussen dawdling through the chicane, much to the frustration of Lewis Hamilton. And then a little later on, it was Carlos Sainz being frustrated, impeded into the long left-hand hairpin introduced last year, with the car ahead jumping out the way at the very last second. Over at McLaren, and they were having some issues of their own, not to do with the car, but with some slippery concrete in their grid box, as after being resurfaced, it was proving a little bit tricky for the drivers as they came in and left from their pit stops. This may be one of the worst complaints in the history of complaints, maybe ever. And then finally over at Aston Martin, it wasn't plain sailing for Seb Vettel in his final F1 Grand Prix weekend. I'm not crying, you are. However, it was a big lock-up into turn 6, but with an eye-dazzling amount of stripy runoff, there was plenty of room to keep it out the barriers. Into FP3, and the first news was surrounding Daniel Ricciardo and his future in F1, as Red Bull announced that he would be joining them as a reserve driver for 2023. So look out Checo, you better be worried. You've got Daniel Ricciardo coming for your seat. On second thoughts, no need to be worried actually. Onto the session then, and it was Pierre Gasly's AlphaTauri to provide the initial action, with its wheel brow deciding to end the season a little bit early and just head off over the curbs at turn 9. This then brought out the red flag in order to collect the debris, which caught out Lewis Hamilton, with the Mercedes driver being investigated for failing to slow under the red flags and passing a McLaren and Haas 2. The stewards coming to the conclusion that there would be no penalty given the two cars were on slower laps and the timing of the red flag as well. And finally, to round out the session, it was bodywork flying off the car of Alex Albon. To be fair, I wouldn't want to be part of the Williams car either. On to qualifying then, and in Q1 it was the Red Bulls that looked to have the best pace, fairly comfortably as well. Meanwhile, at the back it was time to check in on Williams and friends, as they were being joined by Bottas in his Alfa Romeo and Pierre Gasly in the AlphaTauri, along with Kevin Magnussen going from last week's pole to out in Q1. Not saying he's dropping off or anything, but maybe Haas got rid of the wrong person. On to Q2 then, and the first set of laps it was Red Bull 1-2, with Checo over 3/10 ahead of his teammate, and come the end of the session, Max could only close to 2/10 and P4. Further back and come the final runs, Charles Leclerc found himself in the drop zone, before putting in a lap to take him up to P2, slotting in just ahead of teammate Carlos Sainz. Elsewhere, and Lando Norris was last across the line, making his way through and knocking Fernando Alonso out in the process, with the Spaniard joined by 4 different drivers from 4 different teams, with Tsunoda, Schumacher, Stroll and Zhou all knocked out in Q2. Into the final part of the final qualifying session of the season, and the Mercedes pair had the plan to go out first ahead of everyone. Sadly, that plan didn't help them find any pace, with both cars 7/10 off Verstappen's provisional pole time. In behind, it was Sainz and then Perez and Leclerc, with Checo losing out on P2 after going sliding around through the final corner. And as the final laps came in, it was Leclerc first over the line and making his way into P2, with no improvement from Sainz behind. And then that Ferrari P2 and 3 became a P3 and 4, thanks to Sergio Perez helping to lock out the front row for Red Bull. But could the Mercedes pair do anything to split up the Red Bulls and Ferraris? In short, no, as they remained in P5 and P6 for the start of tomorrow's race. On to the final race day of the year, and after some very special moments for Seb on the grid, it was time for lights out, with the front 3 holding position, Hamilton jumping Sainz and Russell losing out to Norris and Ocon in behind. So that's Hamilton into P4, but only up until turn 6, aka the chicane, with Sainz sending one up the inside and Hamilton deciding he'd use his 2021 tactics of cutting across, which while maintaining P4 at the time meant he had to give the place back to Sainz a couple laps later, which then meant he had to re-overtake down towards turn 9 and could then head after Leclerc. Until he didn't head after Leclerc, with Hamilton's pace disappearing like Daniel Ricciardo's talent, allowing Sainz and Russell to overtake on consecutive laps. Meanwhile, in behind, and eyes were on Sebastian Vettel as he tried to get past Esteban Ocon, with Seb going up the inside of the long turn 9 but running wide on exit, allowing Ocon to get back through, which allowed Esteban to become the race's resident train driver as he held up Vettel, Alonso, Stroll and Yuki Tsunoda. And after a few laps of said train, it was time for some pit stops, with every single car that wasn't on hard tyres to start swapping onto the hard tyres. Which meant that with different strategies, Alonso, Tsunoda and Bottas, who started on the hards, were now together on track. And because it's Valtteri and battling any other car, he obviously came out last of those 3. However, for Alonso, getting past Bottas was just about the last thing he'd do in an Alpine, as he had to retire the car just laps later for what would be the 4th time in the last 7 races. And while Alonso will be more happy to be done with that Alpine 30 laps early, for anyone hoping for Vettel Alonso Hamilton donuts, well, just like Fernando, you're also now the victim of Alpine reliability issues. Over at Alfa Romeo, and it was time for the latest edition of Valtteri Bottas attempts to defend against literally anyone, as the Finn had the inside line on Sebastian Vettel but locked up, went deep and gave Seb a free pass through the chicane. At this point, if you couldn't really tell, the race was already a Yas Marina classic, as with the only action literally being that lockup, the race director just decided we'd all be better off by watching Shaquille O'Neal being far too excited with the race. However, over at Red Bull, and it was time to make things genuinely interesting, as they pitted Sergio Perez from second to cover off Leclerc behind, with Ferrari not biting and keeping Charles out, meaning he'd have to take his tyres to the end, setting up a Perez chase for P2 in the Drivers' Championship. Further down the order, and it was time to check in on Seb Vettel, who Aston Martin had royally screwed over, as after looking good in 7th place, the team had elected to go for a poorly executed 1-stop opposed to most people's 2, which had dropped him down to P11, chasing after Daniel Ricciardo. Not saying we're all annoyed at you, Aston Martin, but we're all annoyed at you. Even further down the order, and it was time to check in with two other drivers leaving, and that's Mick Schumacher and Nicholas Latifi. Yep, can see why they're leaving. Back up to the battles at the front, and Sergio Perez had come up through the back of Lewis Hamilton, who was running in third, with Checo making a move into the chicane but losing it straight away on the next straight, because that's just how Yas Marina works. But on the next lap he got through, which meant that he could chase after Leclerc ahead for P2 in the race and also the championship. And with Sainz also pitting for a two-stopper, it meant we had two chases at the front to round out the season. Perez in the Red Bull going after Leclerc in the Ferrari, and then Carlos Sainz chasing after Hamilton in the Mercedes. But as has been the case all season, we were left disappointed, with Hamilton suffering a hydraulic failure just 2 laps from the end and being forced to retire. Meaning while yes, Sainz got P4 easily, more importantly, we the fans were denied even 7 Lewis donuts. But at least we had Perez catching Leclerc, right? Well, kinda not. As with Checo unable to catch up to the Ferrari, it left him in P3, a couple of seconds between Leclerc up in P2. With Max Verstappen still up in first, taking the win pretty comfortably, and this race summing up the season, well, pretty accurately. But it wouldn't be complete without one final send-off from Seb, as he rounded out the season and his career in style. Danke, Seb. Anyways, that's all for now. Thank you very much for watching. If you have enjoyed, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe for more F1 content. It's really been fun this season and I can't wait to keep this channel going, especially into next year. But until next time, take care.